I had some people ask me about like troop presets, specifically for like bear rallies, but then also, what about attacking? What about defending? Vice versa. Okay, if you're doing a bear rally, right? And I'll use this as just an example. Okay. What you can do is basically you want to throw in, I mean, there's kind of a bunch of different ways to tackle this, but I will say that what you're ultimately aiming for here in a perfect world, okay, is probably something like this. Now, depending on what you have access to, okay, and the marksman slot, whether you have Lynn or Greg, most people will probably run this in Gen 3, Gen 4, until they can maybe get this, and then they'll run this up until about Gen 5. And then that's where you might see somebody pick up, like, you get to Greg, you get to higher tiers, but the main gist is you run this with the idea in mind that you're basically going to be doing as much marksman damage with lethality you can do possible. All right, because when you look at this, you're going to want 10%. So in the balance here, you want 10% of this, okay, and you only want 10% here. And then you want the rest to be marksman whenever you're doing a bear rally, okay? And then as far as who actually joins the rally and what heroes they provide to the rally, okay, can be the same mix, right, with 10% of it being the first two unit types and 80% of it going to marksman. But what you'll do for that preset, and again, I don't have presets on like the top bar because a lot of the time if I'm changing out heroes and stuff, it'll flip-flop around on me quite a bit. But if you look at someone like Renee, for example, right, you'll notice that you get extra damage up 200%, damage up by 150, damage up by 75%, right? Compared to Mia, where you're getting 50%, and then you're getting 50% and 50% taken down. The biggest catch-all here is the fact that in my case, I happen to have Mia's exclusive, which is going to increase the trap's rally attack, or the rally troop attack for that matter, by 15%. Had I also done that for Renee's illusion ball, then this becomes more favorable. But because I don't have it, I'm not as pushy about getting this. Now, the only thing I do lose out on is the fact that that's 447 and this is like 290. Okay, so from a stat perspective, I'll usually use Renee. But with that in mind, you also have to kind of perceive what you're doing is basically increasing your marksman lethality. So say you don't have Geronimo, your next best choice is Hector. Okay, if you're in that range. And I mean, ideally, you want to use Lynn because of her skills and abilities here. The downside to using someone like Lynn, though, is that it's a chance dealt and it's only 40%. And this is something, as far as I know, doesn't stack. So you can't, like, how do you say, can't really game it in the sense that if multiple people in your rally join with Lynn, it's not really doing you any good. Like, if you were to use someone like Greg, for example, where you're going to get a damage up by 40% and it's only going to kick off every 20%, plus you get, some rally troop health out of it, this is fine. But I mean, really, even that is kind of pushing it. Like, you'd probably be better off if you had Wayne. Now, like, even I don't have Wayne, but I wish I did, because if I did, I'd use Wayne. Because by and large, what you gain out of using someone like Wayne or even Gwen, and you can see I'm kind of lacking in this regard. I don't really have decent marksman heroes right now. That's one of my, pitfalls right now, is I've got to get that sorted out. I just haven't gotten there yet. And in case you're wondering, how do you get Wayne shards? Well, this is where you get them, Foundry, State of Power, King of Icefield, All Chiefs. That's where you're going to get Wayne shards at. Okay, but the main gist here is that in a perfect world, you would probably use Hector, you would more than likely use Renee, and then probably Wayne. And if you couldn't use one of those, then Mia is the next best choice. But ultimately, the goal here is that you're wanting to buff the rally troop attack, your rally lethality, because if you look at what Dawnsword has, it's just troop attack, okay, for the actual rally itself. And you're just buffing the living bejeebus out of it as much as you can to do more damage. And then if anything, that's really about all you focus in on. Now, when you're starting out, okay, it's fine to go split even, and if you are curious, like, well, I don't have all these heroes, well, what the heck, don't sweat it, because there are some other alternatives. Like, for example, in this particular slot, what is often going to be picked when you're starting out is probably going to be Jesse. You'll probably throw Sion. And then your only other option really is, until about Gen 2, do you start to use Flint for a while, and you work your way up to Gen 3. But even then, most of the time, like in the very early phases, this is what someone's going to use until they get to Gen 2 or Gen 3. And this assumes that they don't decide to pay to win and go and get Geronimo. Okay? But that's really about all you need to know in that regard as far as bear rallies go. Like, once you get to probably about Gen 3, do I recommend you drop the mixed rally approach and go 10, 10, 80 on your, troops as far as the ratios and balance goes. Okay? Now, as far as rallies on base and, how that all plays out. Okay, it's a different animal, but I mean, really, you just have to kind of pay attention to the fact that, say you decide you're going to go, say rally something. And I don't know, if it's something simple and trivial, like, say you're going to go out and you're going to send a rally at somebody that, I don't know, for any reason you feel like you want to rally attack someone individually, the biggest concern that you can have is that the defender's going to get the biggest advantage. And so usually you want to leave this to the whales in your guild. You don't want to be the, if anything, the min-maxing that is done is almost all exclusively in the chief profile, really. And then what, little you have in heroes is also going to have a big factor in this. But like, say like if I was going to rally a player, what I do differently is, a lot of the time, what I will do is I will balance it out where I don't really worry so much about, say like I'll probably do like a 50, and then I'll bring this up to 20 and this up to 20. And, actually, now that I think about it, I think it was more like 25 in these two ratios. And then the remaining two. I was doing something pretty similar to this. 25% of it being infantry lancers and then 50% of it being marksmen. Basically with the idea in mind that if you attack them, you're going to try and kill off as many of their infantry as you can possible. And if anything, the lancers here, you can kind of get away with bringing these down to like even 10% and bring the infantry up and just do basically a 40, 10, 50. Because the idea is to basically get your infantry in there long enough to keep doing damage on the actual infantry line that they have. Because what you're ultimately aiming to do is break down the amount of infantry they have. But, in terms of what you use as heroes go, it's really dependent on what you have available. But for much the same reason in Bear Trap, it's running under the same kind of logic. But I will say that a lot of the time you will tend to favor the higher gen heroes, because when you look at it from the standpoint of stats, okay, the fact that you're getting 440% as opposed to, say, like a meagerly 200 is a pretty noticeable difference. And I would say most of the super pay-to-wins are dumping, if not all of their stuff into their gear, really, because this is where you see a substantial chunk, 50% coming into infantry attack, plus if you mastery forge it, then you've got that bonus on top of it. and they're regularly usually having multiple sets, so they'll have multiple heroes. Otherwise, you have to basically know that whenever you decide to do a rally, you've got to switch out your gear on that hero if you don't already have it on there. And about the only thing really that, I would see people do differently is it's all really dependent on the actual exclusive. So like for example, if you're defending, it's going to make more sense to use Hector's exclusive if you have it maxed out, that is, because you're going to get some defender troop attack, and then by inverse of what you've even seen when I was mentioning with like defender bonuses, okay? You look at someone like Philly, okay, and you look at what you have in the early game, that's troop health, it's like primarily what you end up needing a lot of the time is a lot of attack and a lot of HP when you're tanking and defending, and the same inverse, it's you want a lot of attack and a lot, if anything, you want most of that damage to flake off. So oftentimes defense and HP is what you focus in on when you're defending, but your attacks are going to be focused more on attack. You don't really struggle too much with defense. You usually struggle with, if anything, adding HP and attack as a way to really cross the median, so to speak, with all of those different rallies that you throw at them. But, again, that's all going to be really strictly a stats game. It becomes a question of, do you have all of your, troop bonuses active? Do you have not only the troop bonuses, do you have a pet skill active? Did you go in here and apply your 12-hour 2 bonuses? All of that's going to factor into that. So as far as a preset is concerned, I mean, I've already given you an example of like an attack preset, but a defensive preset, you don't really focus so much on marksman anymore. You're not too worried about killing off their infantry. You're more interested in killing off their ability to hurt you. So I tend to go towards something like a 30-50-20, where I still want infantry in my line, but I want more lancers to counteract any marksmen that are coming down to kill my infantry. And that to me is generally what I'll use when I'm defending. But that said, you do have to occasionally run into these scenarios where, okay, you may be defending multiple places at a time. And when that happens, I often think the easiest solution is this: just blanket even. Because when you do it that way, you're not worried about the ratio so much. You're just even out completely. So you get a pretty mixed answer. And that sometimes that's the best solution, is not to try and play with the ratio too much. Because even though, yeah, in some situations where like in Bear Trap, yeah, it doesn't make as much sense to have a lot of infantry or lancers because they're not really doing the damage. Like, you need marksmen to be doing the damage because that's what's going to give you all those points, but on the same token, if you're somebody that is struggling in warfare, that's a whole different conversation. And it gets complicated because, again, it depends on what heroes they have on that wall and what their fort is. So there's not like a one easy set preset for going around and attacking other players, and it also vaguely pretty much depends on what even you're doing. Like, if you're soloing, that's one thing. If you're defending and reinforcing, that's another thing. Reinforcing a player, oftentimes I feel like it really just, if anything, it behooves you to send a lot of lancers if you're ever trying to defend someone. And it depends if they have enough infantry in their base. If they don't have a lot of infantry, then add more infantry. Because if anything, that's just going to prevent the opponent from being able to soak through their other lines. It's like, it just depends on what the situation has in store for you. And you really can't evaluate that for every case by case the same way, and so for that reason, I feel like hopefully that makes sense, though, at least from the standpoint of Bear Trap. And really, in general, like, if you're ever going to do like rallies even on these, you can send a mixed march on a normal Frost Gorilla or even like level 8s. It's not really important, really. And about the only time where you really start to get into the weird world of what I call wacky freaking science is when you start, filling forts for, like Crazy Joe. Yeah, you can get a little wacky there if you'd like, but for the most part, mixed marches are fine, and if anything, in Crazy Joe, the one thing that a lot of people will do with their presets and those is they emphasize sending a lot of infantry. and just allow your player base to basically soak, if they've got the marksman, that is. Now, if they don't, then it usually makes more sense to do a 50-50 of infantry and marksman, just because they're going to live that much longer. But, again, you could just as easily send a mixed march, and you're not going to do yourself any harm. The only time where it makes sense, though, to do these, like, one-type blends is if you have the troops. If you can afford to have 600,000 or 700,000, for example, like I do, it's not going to bother you that you've, sent almost all of it into one unit type. But it does make more sense in the grand scheme of things if you're having to reinforce multiple people at a time to just do it evenly so that you're not making yourself open to attack as well, because that's the other concern you'll have. Is I have run into this many times where I'll be in the middle of, not only like Foundry, but even during Canyon does that become a problem, because if you get empty, you're going to find yourself in a situation relatively quickly. Like in Canyon, it happens whenever you're, say like if you hold a base, right? You don't want to get too carried away and send, one march one way, two marches the other way. Because what will wind up happening is they'll squeeze the one march you had when you should have probably kept them together. It's a little different in Canyon now, but if you think of like Foundry as an example, Foundry's more, it's more of a how do you say, a sunk cost type situation. It's more like if you want to test these ideas out, right? I think Foundry is the best place to do that. If you're wanting to see how well a preset works, or even the presets that I've mentioned you can easily test this stuff out and check it out for yourself. It's relatively straightforward, and Foundry is a really great playing ground for that, because you're not going to lose your troops at the end of it, more or less. Now, if, let's say, for example, you get yourself tied into like Frostfire Mine, the same thing. It's that I've really personally, I love Frostfire more for just the opportunity to gather in multiple places at a time. It gives you the opportunity to really bounce around and just try to decide where you're going to go and how you're going to attack it. But needless to say, that is pretty much everything I think you would need to know regarding presets. If there's something else you need to know, though, feel free to ask in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys next time.